I have you could have predicted this question. So I'm so glad that antiquarianism raised its shadow in this Venn diagram. I'm just so struck by the fact that at the same time, 1430s-ish, in the same neighborhoods, Florence, Rome, and some other places, uh, that some of these things are happening in concert with one another. And so my question, which is, I mean, you say more as you wish, how and why?
So I think one thing is just above all important here, it seems to me, is that if you're an intellectual, a humanist in the 14th, 15th, through 16th century, it's kind of natural to want to know how we got where we are and why we can't speak Latin anymore, and why we don't know what these buildings are and they're ruined anyhow, and so on. So I think that, in a sense, it's not surprising. I mean, this is something Peter Burke made this point a long, long time ago. Just seeing historical distance as vividly as you did every day in Rome in the 14th century, it was kind of obvious to begin thinking, well, how did this happen? And quite evident that the textual record wasn't going to tell you very much of anything about that, the historical textual record. So you'd have to find something else. That's part of it. Another part is conjecture, which, because antiquarianism lives by conjecture. Biondo is always conjecturing in his antiquarian work because, as he says, he doesn't know which building is which. He has to work it out, and he's well aware that he's often going to be wrong. So that's part of his practice as well. And so it's not an accident that that he has this fascination with using evidence that isn't explicitly aimed at the question he's solving to solve it. And it's what antiquarians do too. I remember, for some reason, I'm remembering Eric Cochrane. We were reading a letter of Machiavelli's in which he writes about sitting and gossiping with a couple of friends on the bench in front of a palazzo. And Eric looked up and said, "See, street corner society in Chicago." That there's a way in which, conjecture is a necessary implement, and printing makes conjecture respectable because you may think, well, I have manuscripts, I don't really want to choose them. But by the 15th, 16th century, you're editing texts off printed Vorlagen that are full of mistakes. The proofreader, the typesetters give you lots more mistakes. So half of your time, anyone here is old enough to remember correcting real proofs and the wonderful things they came up with in them. So you really, conjecture becomes more and more legitimate in the 16th century. You have to make conjectures. And even a great Florentine scholar, Pier Vittori, who in the 1530s is a real enemy of conjecture, by the end of his life, he's saying, no, we have to do this. There's no other way in which we can hope to restore these texts or restore these practices. So all of those things are part of it. I actually start, if this becomes a book, it will start with Boccaccio and Christine de Pizan, because one of the earliest conjectural histories of culture is Boccaccio's history of how female gods are actually the women who created all the implements of culture, like, cultivation and bread and so on. And then Boccaccio typically has a sort of crisis and says, but was this a good idea? Weren't we better off without all of this? And Christine de Pizan then takes his material, rewrites it much better, and says, Boccaccio, go stick your head in a pig. Of course, civilization is better than not having civilization, and that's thanks to women. It's a real argument about whether the conjecture of euhemerism can restore a past which is not to be found anywhere else. And of course, these are works that are very popular and widely read. So I think that there's something to be said for starting there before they have the real tools in place. And Boccaccio actually does do conjectures in textual criticism, so he is someone for whom that's an actor's category. But I think that you're right, and I'm trying to work out how to make all of these things come together. And I'm also trying to work out where to stop, and advice would be helpful. My favorite story that I found is the story of Sir Thomas Browne, William Dugdale, and the backbone of a grampus, a large marine animal. So Dugdale was writing a history of drainage. He was paid to do it by the company that was draining the fens to shift the Overton window and show that drainage was a good thing, because the fens had this great culture of their own where they knew how to like be shepherds on stilts. Casaubon sees shepherds on stilts and says, "Wow, they're great. You know, they're really good." And so you have to prove to people that the fens are no good, that that this is it's just all covered with water and useless. And Dugdale set out to do that. And Dugdale is he's a document man, so he piles on the documents and looks at sites. But he also has to show that in antiquity, civilized peoples drained. And so he gets Thomas Brown's help, and Brown gives him help about Babylonian drainage and Roman drainage and Greek drainage and so on. But when it comes to the Grampus, they come to a parting of the ways, because there's this vertebrae of a marine animal found by Robert Cecil in his estate and treasured by the Cecils, and they finally give it to Brown. And Dugdale says, "See, what doesn't this prove something really important? Does this prove the universal flood?" People were starting to doubt it. Or does this prove there was a local flood? And Brown is the author of Urn Burial. Brown says, yeah, things move and change in the earth. You have to be a little more careful than this. And at the end of his letter to Dugdale, he says, "I can't even conjecture what kind of conjecture you're going to base on your conjecture." So that might be a good place to stop. But the 17th century is a real problem here, because the great Cambridge and other scholars who really revived the study of Scottish conjectural history, the only real source for it they look to is really 17th century legal and political thought, the state of nature, Pufendorf's history of property, and so on. And it seems to me that is precursoritis. There's no reason to assume that that is where what these guys are building on, rather than a wider and more vaguely known body of discussion with which they would have been familiar. But the 17th, and then there's always the great and frightening figure of Vico, who naturally is just there to terrify and confuse anybody who tangles with him. The entire Renaissance and Enlightenment on crack and in your face in one person. But he seems like an obvious candidate for a book, maybe for the end of a book like this. Yet at the same time, I'm a little scared about that prospect.